is going on, guys? Josh with the Mercedes Swap Shop here. Remember to like, comment, share, subscribe. Go like me on Facebook, follow me on Instagram to get all the latest news about the swaps I'm doing, things I'm doing with my car, and turn on the notifications when you subscribe to this channel. This is going to be a whole video series covering swaps for the Daimler Chrysler era, 1998 to 2007. Other years and stuff fall into that too, so just remember to subscribe and turn on the notifications so you know when I'm doing this stuff. Doing a video about engines today, specifically the Daimler Chrysler era of Mercedes, and we're going to talk about the differences between the engines, what some of that means, and then which ones I would suggest if you're going to do a swap, which ones that, you know, would be best suited for what you're trying to do. The Daimler Chrysler is what I like to call when Mercedes made everything and Chrysler put their name on it. But this is going to focus between 1998 and 2007. They still sold, like, some of the Crossfire guys are going to be like, well, they made like 08 models. Those were all leftover 07s. The board meeting to decide not to be affiliated with Chrysler anymore happened in 2007. So I'm not going to go over the M112, the M112 E24, 26, or 28 engines, the 2.4 liter, 2.6 liter, or 2.8 liter V6s. I feel like a bang for buck. It just doesn't make sense. We're not going to talk about the M272 350 V6s. They have weak timing chains, the price, and the torque for the price versus the M113. Doesn't make sense. We're also not going to talk about the twin turbo V12s, the M275s, and that's just, the motors are crazy expensive. The size is huge. Fitting it into a car isn't going to work for most people. Like C-Class, SLKs, you're not going to fit that twin turbo V12 in there. The weight and then reliability. So where we're going to start first is actually talking about the M113s. That's going to be our initial talking point. So you have three of them. You have the E43, the E50, and the E55. The 43 is 4.3 liter, 275 horsepower, 295 foot-pounds at the crank, 89.9 millimeter bore, 84 millimeter stroke, 10-to-1 compression. The E50 is a 5 liter, 302 horsepower, 339 foot-pounds at the crank, 97 millimeter bore, 84 millimeter stroke, 10-to-1. The E55 is going to be the 5.4 liter naturally aspirated, 362 horsepower, 391 foot-pounds of torque at the crank, 97 millimeter bore, 92 millimeter stroke. These varied in compression, and it's hard to tell which are what. We'll get into how you would tell later. But those came in 10.5 to 1 and 11 to 1 compression ratios. The newer, the better. So the E32, the 3.2 liter naturally aspirated V6 that the Crossfires have, SLK 320s, E320s, the 320 engines. Those are actually a direct derivative of the M113 E43, the 4.3. It's two of the cylinders are out to make a V6, and then they put in a countershaft to balance the engine. 224 horsepower, 232 foot-pounds of torque, 10-to-1 compression. It's the exact same. Everything's the exact same between those motors. I see a lot of people talk about, well, the Crossfire is rated at 215 horsepower, and the SRT6 is rated lower than the SLK 32. That's a marketing thing. It's not actually a difference in the tune. So some people will go back and forth on the internet all day, every day. I have seen both files side by side laid over one another. It's the exact same file. There's no difference in the tuning. In some of the newer cars, in the modern generation Mercedes, there are differences in the tuning between like a C-Class and an E-Class. The C63, the driver's wish, is actually like cut off, so only 70% throttle body opening at full throttle, whereas like the E63 has 100%. So the tune isn't different, but the driver's wish for throttle to throttle body is altered. They don't do that on these engines. None of the M112s or M113s, none of them are tuned differently. People talk about the S55, I think, has 496 horsepower, the supercharged version. It's not different than the E55. The tune is not different. Anyway, it's like a marketing thing. S-Class costs more, so they're going to say it has more power. The E37 3.7 liter, a lot of people don't even know this engine actually exists. It's 241 horse, 254 foot-pounds of torque. Not bad, you know, a healthy-ish jump, 20 from the 32. It's a direct derivative of the E50, the 5 liter. So take 2 cylinders out, now you have a 3.7 liter. This is where it gets a little more complicated. The E55 ML, or compressor K, or as Stardust likes to put it, the M155-9. The M155 is the SLR version, which is a little bit different. We're not going to talk about that one. I mean, you can, I just saw one for sale for the first time, and the guy wants 35 grand for that motor. It's, for $35,000, you could put that into a 5.4 supercharged motor from like an E-Class, and you could easily, for 35 grand, you could easily make that power. 469 horsepower, 516 foot-pounds of torque. Like I said, the S-Class is rated higher, 490, 530 or something. Take these numbers loosely. People will dyno them and actually pull higher than what the factory would have rated it when they do correction factors for what the crank would be. 9-to-1 compression. So then we go to the E32 ML, which is the actual and official engine designation for the 3.2 supercharged, but everybody calls it K. So E32K, 349 horse, 332 foot-pounds of torque, 9-to-1 compression. That's going to be across the board again. Similarities between all of them. This is where it's going to get a little crazy too, because there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of people who read such and such from wherever, and you know, they take it as biblical because it came from their favorite magazine or whatever. And Wikipedia's even got some of it wrong. The problem isn't the people posting the information. The problem is that there haven't been enough people to dissect it. The original information from Mercedes never actually went out about some of the stuff. So let's get to some of the basics. They're all aluminum blocks and heads, open deck, 90-degree Vs. They use an Aluseal bore coating, 70% aluminum, 30% silicone. Single overhead cam, 2 plugs per cylinder. All of them have forged steel rods and pistons. I know that's going to drive some people crazy, but we'll get back to the pistons in a sec. So the differences for the engines would be the rod design. So the material isn't different. They're all forged steel. But the design is different between the naturally aspirated, the AMGs, and then the Ks. And I say the AMGs, then the Ks, because the 5.4, the E55, is an AMG, even though it's still just a naturally aspirated M113, you know, just slightly redesigned. So if you were going from the E50, the 5 liter, to the 5.4 liter, the 5.4 liter is going to have strengthened rods. So it's the same material and everything, it's just slightly different design, and makes it stronger. And then same thing when you go over to the E55, the 55K motor. That motor is actually going to have stronger rods. Same material, but it's designed differently. Valve springs, they're all different, but it's not, again, it's not the material. The difference would be length between some of the motors. Some of them have the same spring. I think most of them, like all of these ones right here, have the same springs. I'm not 100% sure on that one though. And then the differences for the pistons actually come down to the wrist pins, the ring lands. There's write-ups about this, so you can actually go out there and see what it looks like. Some of them are, you know, as you go through NA to AMG to K, the wrist pins get, it's not even bigger. They just have a different design. I think it might be a little bit bigger. Piston shape is what dictates compression. So we have some people that want to talk about like head gasket sizes, or the head itself is different. You got to look at it from like a cost perspective. If you were the company that were putting these out, you're not going to make like 4 different variations for the heads for basically the same motor that has basically all the same specs. You're not going to change that. So what can you change to change the compression? The piston shape. So I have these right here. These are from the 32. And if you look at the way this one is, the NA is going to be very similar to this. It's just raised here in the center. It's not as deep of a dish right there. And you know, there's some other shapes that are a little bit different. So most of the swaps are obviously the M112s to the M113s. Now, the majority of the M112 motors made are the E32, the 3.2 liter V6. So most of the people that come to me are V6 to V8, M112 E32 to V8. They want to know, what do I need to do? What are the differences? What all needs to be changed? A lot of people think that it's too hard, that they can't do it, and that's not true. It's actually very easy. If you can turn a wrench, you can swap the engine. You need a cherry picker. That's like the only equipment that you probably don't have that you would need. So there is rewiring, and that's going to depend model to model, but it's all very simple and basic. The engines that the M113s primarily came in, they're typically going from a car that has a front SAM module. So they have the EIS, which is the infrared. Okay, so it's a knob, it's not an actual key. And if they're running this, then they're running a SAM module for the fuse block up in the front under the hood. And because of that, because some of the people who have older cars, SLKs or Crossfires, MLs, they run a K40. K40 is just a very simple, like, there's relays and fuses, and that's what triggers fuel pump and starter circuit and all that kind of stuff. There's one plug that has to be rewired. It's 4 wires, and then you jump one other plug. Very simple rewiring. You need the right oil pan. 2 types of pans. So you find the car with your pan, swap it over. Very simple. Cooling. So when you go to do a bigger motor, obviously you're gonna need better cooling. The stock fan won't work some of the time, depending on the model again. If you're in an E-Class or an S-Class, you can use the stock fan. The stock electric fan will be fine. You don't even need to worry about it. If you're going into an SLK, a Crossfire, something of that nature, then you're actually going to need to go with something different. I recommend the C43 mechanical fan. You get the clutch, get the shroud, modify the shroud so that it's not stationary. Your motor is going to be torquing over. It'll impact the shroud, rip it out, and throw it, and you'll start pulling coolant tubes. Ask me how I know. So I would modify the shroud so that, you know, you're not getting fingers jammed into the fan or anything. It'll help direct the cooling. But the C43 mechanical, maybe in front of the radiator, an aftermarket pusher, wire it up to the stock wiring. That'll keep the system happy and keep you nice and cool. The exhaust manifolds. So again, depending on the model, they might make manifolds that'll work for you. So if you're going from an E320 to an E500, there are manifolds out there that you can buy, exhaust manifolds, that'll bolt right up, put everything where it needs to go, bam bam, done. Real simple. For the Crossfire and the SLKs, it's not quite that easy. They didn't come with V8s, so you essentially have to modify the V6 exhaust manifolds to have an extra port. Cut the front port off the V6, cut 2 ports off of a V8, weld them together. You have an air gap in the exhaust manifold, so you got to be careful who you take it to. Make sure that they can weld on thin stainless, you know, TIG or something, and you'll be good. But you need to keep that downpipe the way that it's ran stock. Otherwise, you're building from scratch. A lot of people forget when they're doing swaps, oil, coolant, and plugs. Don't forget oil, don't forget coolant, to factor that into your budget. And plugs, because if you have the motor out, you might as well do the plugs, and it's a lot easier out of the car than it is in the car. NA to NA, so M112 to M113, you're adding 4 inches to the front. So take the distance at the crank pulley, add 4 inches, that's where you're at with an M113. If you're going from a M112 to the M113K, it's 6 inches, roughly. It's like 5 and some change. You're gonna need like slim aftermarket fans. If you decide to go with only electrical fans, you can do it. It's not gonna like it. It's gonna be really hot. It'll run hot when it's hot outside. So you know, you need to be mindful of that. So one of the other things to keep in mind when you're going from the M112 to M113, you can retain those stock motor mounts. You need the arms, you need the actual like shock for the motor. That'll suffice as well, in addition to this other stuff. The weight difference between all of these. So V6 to V8, 100 pounds. V6 NA to V6K, 100 pounds. And then the V6K to the V8K isn't quite 100 pounds, or is it 100 pounds? I think it, that one I'm going to have to look into. When you're doing the swap and you want more than 400 horsepower, you want modability, customizability, you may not want the 5.4 naturally aspirated because you don't want to cap at 400. You might want more versatility down the road. You can do the 32, the Supercharged V6, which some people like the idea of because there's still a lot of options to get those in the 400 to 500 range for wheel horsepower. So you can go from the E32 to the Supercharged 32. I think that's a great swap. And that'll get you like a very big bump in power and everything. You don't need, it's more than the 5.4 naturally aspirated, but it's not quite as much brute force as the 5.4 supercharged. Plus price wise, it's not too bad. It's somewhere in the middle as well. So another option to keep in mind. So if you have a V6, E32, E37, I would recommend the E55, the 5.4 naturally aspirated. I have tunes for this for 400 horse. So you would be going from 224 horse in an E32 to 400. I mean, that's 170 something horsepower jump. That's huge. That's what I would recommend doing. If you're gonna go from, you know, the E32, the 32K, you really only have like one option. You already have all the cooling and everything in there for the 55K motor. So I mean, sure, you got to get like you have to get an SL55 fuel pump. If you're going from an NA, you have to get all the plumbing for the intercooler. That's one of the inconveniences. When you do the swap, what I recommend is done at the same time is your alternator, because the V6 to the V8, They are different. The 150 amp to 180, I think it is, or 185, 155 to 185, I can't remember. Get your brakes done and do your suspension. You might as well do that stuff first, then swap. But if you swap and then that's the plan over the next couple months after, you know, that's fine too. Just have the plan to do all of that stuff in the long run. You're gonna want it. And don't wait forever. Like this should all be done relatively at the same time. Non-problem parts, as long as it's good and perfectly fine, if you do the swap, it'll remain perfectly fine. That's diff, axles, your steering, and the drive shaft. And I actually get these questions all the time. Like, do I need to replace my differential? Do I need to replace like the steering setup? Do I need to replace my drive shaft? Like, you don't need to do any of that on any of the models. Like, you're fine if you're throwing in a transmission that didn't come in a car and you're like, what drive shaft do I use? What, you know, it only matters for certain things, but none of these matter. Like, these parts don't matter. It's not too bad. In the next video, we're gonna go over transmissions. We're gonna go over what 3 transmissions they offered, well 4 actually, that they offered in the Daimler Chrysler era, which ones I would recommend for what swap, and then which ones I can do that a lot of people don't realize you can do, and then we'll go over like the differences, talking about like the 722.6, the fact that everybody thinks 722.6 is just the whole thing, like the whole generation of transmission. Like, no, there's 601, 602, 603, all the way to 699. So we'll go over what category, what they all fall into, what the torque ratings are, all of it, and then we'll go over the other 3 transmissions that are swappable into these for, you know, if that's what you're trying to do, if the automatic isn't the way you want to go. There's a sequential that you could do. Cool stuff. So if anybody has any other questions or needs any other information about the engines, you know, feel free to contact me. But I mean, to keep it simple, it's very simple. If you want more power than the V6, go with the 55. For the price and everything, it's just what makes the most sense. If you're looking for, I want 500 or more, you know, I want to blow everything out of the water and I want mod potential down the road, you got to go with a 55K. That's the engines. Make sure that you like, subscribe. I have more videos planned coming down in the future, so go ahead and share, get the word out there that I'm going to be doing this video series for people, so that you can understand some of the things that you won't need to change, things that you might need to change, things to look out for. This is just the introduction, the basics about the M112 and the M113.